Hello everyone, my name is Shruchi Khanna. Today I will be discussing about the process of organization development along with its step involved. Before we go ahead with the OD process, let's revisit the definition of what is organization development. Organization development is a process of planned change in organization, which is long-range system-wide process. It utilizes behavioral science interventions of an educational, reflexive, self-examining, learn-to-do-it-yourself nature, and are directed towards human and social processes of the organization, especially individuals, beliefs, attitude and value, and the culture and process of work groups. As a result of it, it leads to achievement of goals that an organization needs to adapt, cope, solve its problem and renew itself. Therefore, if I quote Beckett definition of organization development, it clearly states, and one of my personal favorite, it clearly states that it's an effort planned, organization-wide, managed from the top to increase organization effectiveness and health through planned intervention in organization processes using behavioral science knowledge. Now, what is organization development process all about? An OD process is actually based on the action of a research model which begins with an identification of a problem or a need for change. The process proceeds through assessment, planning of intervention, implementing the intervention, gathering the data to evaluate the intervention, and determining it if the progress has been made or if there is a need of further intervention. Whenever an organization undergoes a change or identifies a problem, it could be a cultural problem or a social problem or a problem which needs to be tackled on an immediate basis your external factors or internal factors, there has to be a need for change. Once that need comes into there, the process then involves about how to go ahead about it, which means how to plan about. Once the planning part is done, implementation of the intervention is required, which is generally done by gathering of data. Once the data is captured, accordingly the process is involved and the intervention starts happening using behavioral interventions. Now, the organization development process doesn't end here. Actually, the end of the organizational development process will be called satisfactory only if the data is captured to find out with whatever intention we started to begin with, has it been able to fulfill those expectations or goals or not. Therefore, an organization development is actually a very cyclical process. It's a continuous process. It is not that plan A will lead to plan B and we end the organization development process. It is a continuous process where the entire organization is involved in a very planned way, and as a result the desired development result is obtained. Now let's talk about steps involved in OD process. The OD process generally begins when the organization recognizes that there is a problem which exists and this problem is actually impacting the mission or the health of the organization. As a result, if we do not change, we perish, and when that survival instinct actually comes into picture, change is desired. It can also begin when a leadership has a vision of better way or wants to improve the organization. Sometimes in an organization, a new CEO or a CMD joins in and therefore brings in a lot of his own beliefs and thought processes. So if a leadership also thinks that they can manage or improve the organization in a better way, then also the organization undergoes a change. We have to be very clear that an organization does not always have to be in trouble to implement the organizational development activities. Once the decision is made to change the situation, the next step is actually to assess the situation to fully understand. Now, this assessment can be conducted in many ways. It can be a documentation review, an organizational sensing, a focus group, an interviewing or a surveying, discussions, group discussions, one-to-one discussions. They can be done at any level by an expert hired by the organization or by the members of the organization. Generally, this is done by the HR department of any organization or a consultant which the company decides to hire from outside. After the situation is assessed, defined and understood, the next plan is to intervene. This type of change desired would determine the nature of the intervention. Now, intervention is actually defined once the situation is assessed. Intervention could include training or development, team intervention such as team building for management or employees or establishment of change teams, structural interventions or individual interventions. Once the intervention is planned, once the company decides that okay, this is what we need to do, this is where we have to intervene at team leader level or an individual level or a structural level changes, then it is implemented. It is very important that in an OD process, relevant data is gathered before and after implementation of the intervention. The data gathered would be determined by the change goals. So, for example, if the intervention was training and development for an individual employee or a group, data has to be gathered. The data gathered would be a measure change in knowledge and competencies. So, if I say that this organization, this set of people working in a particular team needs a particular training, then once the training is done, the evaluation has to be done on the knowledge or on the measures that the organization takes care of. This data is actually used to determine the effectiveness of the intervention. The post data collection becomes a very important factor. Why? Because it will always determine the effectiveness of the intervention. It is reported once the effectiveness is decided, found out, it is actually reported to the organization decision makers. The decision makers then determine if the intervention has met its goal. So if a CEO has gone ahead to a consultant or to an HR department or an in-house who is doing an OD process by saying that okay, this is what I am expecting, and once the data is gathered, this data when shared with the top management and they say that yes, this is what we intended to achieve and it has been achieved, then actually it calls for the review. The decision maker determine if the intervention has met its goal. If the intervention met its goal, the process can end, which is depicted by raising of the development bar. If it did not, the decision is made whether to continue the cycle or to carry out other intervention to end it. So as I said, example, that if in my organization set of people needed particular training, an OD intervention was done that okay, before done showed that these set of employees needed training. Past data said that these employees have been trained and their effectiveness through knowledge is checked. If the knowledge is good, if they have gathered the knowledge in the right way, then the sales, let's say it was a sales team, so the sales would increase, their knowledge about the product would increase, their closing ratio with the customers would increase. So if that change happens, which means that your OD intervention, which was building or training the team on knowledge level, is right and it has brought the right impact, then it calls for the termination of the client and the consultant relationship. In case this has not happened and the planned intervention brought some other result or did not brought about the result that we were expecting, then it would call for another intervention or a third intervention happening basis that. So very clearly I will just go through the steps involved in the OD process as mentioned in the PPT. It is awareness of need of change, entry of a change agent or a consultant, a client and a consultant relationship, information collection by consultant. This is a very important part of the OD process. Joint diagnosis of the problem by consultant and client, development of action plan and strategies, implementation of action plans, monitoring and reviewing the progress of the actions, stabilization of the changes, and termination of a client and consultant relationship. Now if I talk about the OD process action research plan. Now Wendell L. French and Cecil Bell defined organization development at one point as an organization improvement through action research. Now action research, if you have gone through my previous PPT, action research is actually the backbone of any organization development process. Action research talks about survey feedbacks, it talks about implementing of those feedbacks on how to go ahead with that change process and then defining it. So if one idea can be summarized to summarize OD's underlying philosophy, it would be action research, which was conceptualized by Kurt Lewin and then later elaborated and expanded by other behavioral scientists. Concerned with social change and more particularly with effective permanent social change, Lewin, who was the father of action research plan, believed that the motivation to change was strongly related to action, which means that if people are active in decisions affecting them, they are more likely to adopt new ways. So if I am involved in the decision making process which is regarding me, I will be more active and more likely to adopt those new ways which the organization tends to perform. Now if you see at the figure that I am trying to share over here, which is a system model of action research process, Lewin's description of process of the change involves 3 steps. Unfreezing. Now if you see the unfreezing part, it can be defined as faced with dilemma or disconfrontation, the individual or a group becomes aware of need of change. Now I'll take a very recent example. I'm sure people living in Delhi would be knowing that there was a ban on the diesel vehicle that we talked about. As a result, the organizations affected by it are going for a need for change because of external factors coming in or because of the environmental issues coming in. The desire to change actually was inbuilt in the organization, built in manufacturers. Now the situation is, which is changing. If you see the second box that I'm talking about, the second is diagnosis and the new models of the behavior which needs to be explored and tested. And refreezing, which is application of the new behavior if evaluated and if reinforced, adopted. So figure 1 summarizes the steps in the process involved in planned change through action research. Action research in this entire structure is depicted as a cyclic process of change. The cycle begins with series of planning actions initiated by the client and the change agent. Now the client and the change agent, they work together and they talk about preliminary diagnosis, they talk about data gathering, they talk about feedback of results, and then joint plan action. The principal elements of this stage includes preliminary diagnosis, data gathering, feedback of results, and joint action planning. In the language of system theory, if you see at this is actually the input phase, in which the client system becomes aware of problems as yet unidentified, realizes that it may need outside help to effect changes, and shares it with the consultant the process of problem diagnosis. The second stage of action research is the action part, which is a transformation phase. This stage includes actions relating to learning processes and to planning and executing behavioral changes in the organization. If you see in figure 1, feedback at this stage would move via feedback loop A. So something changing, they find something, they go into the planning part, and would have the effect of altering previous planning to bring the learning activities of the client system into better alignment with changed objectives. So during this learning process, during this identification process, if they feel that there is something that needs to be further worked on, they will go back to the planning. So feedback loop A go back to the planning stage. The third stage of action research is the output or the result phase. This stage includes actual change in behavior, resulting from corrective actions taken following the second stage. Data is again gathered from the client system so that progress can be determined and necessary adjustments in learning activities can be made. Minor adjustments of this nature can be made via feedback loop B. So if they find certain changes, minor changes, very minor, major changes happen only in feedback loop A if they really have to go ahead and make some further interventions. Feedback loop B talks about very minimum changes that we are talking about. The action research model in figure 1 closely follows Lewin's repetitive cycle of planning, action, and measuring results. So it's a repetitive cycle. Once the refreezing happens, then it goes back, find out the data, okay, this plan has brought in this much result. Now if I have to go ahead and want to get a better result, then the again unfreezing part, changing and refreezing part begins. So it's a continuous process, it's a cycle. The action stage is actually the period of changing, that is trying out new forms of behavior in an effort to understand and cope with systems problem. There's an inevitable overlap between the stages. since the boundaries are not clear cut and cannot be in a continuous process. So it is very, very clear that OD process, action research plan, is actually a cyclical and a constant changing process. Action research is problem centered. We have to be very, very clear that it is a problem centered, client centered and action oriented. It involves the client system in diagnostic, active learning, problem finding. Data are not returned. Now whatever data the consultant or the internal recruitees go ahead and find out, they are not just returned back in a form of a written report, but instead are fed back in an open joint sessions and the client and the change agent. So there's a common meeting that happens where they are changing their ideas, they're changing their feedbacks, they're discussing whatever data that they have collected. So it's not a report format that they will go back and tell you that, okay, this is what your organization thinks. Yes, there is surveys, there are data to be shared, but then it's more of an open discussion that we're talking about. And then the client and the consultant actually come at a very common ground in devising methods for finding the real causes, and then in developing plans for coping up with them realistically and practically. So as I said in my previous presentations, that OD intervention is actually a top-down approach, now reinforces when you have understood this entire process. If any organization has to actually go for a change, if it has to undergo a change, a behavioral change or a system change or a structural change, then it has to be a top-down approach. It cannot be possible if the top of the management is not okay with the OT intervention happening. So going ahead, scientific data method in the form of data gathering, forming hypothesis, testing hypothesis, measuring results, they are all integral part of the process. Action research also sets in motion a long-range cyclical self-correcting mechanism for maintaining and enhancing the effectiveness of client's system by leaving the system with practical and useful tools for self-analysis and self-renewal. So the action research plan is such beautifully designed that once it gives its input, once it gives its ways of enhancing the effectiveness of client system, they leave the organization in a very comfortable way and leaves the organization to utilize those self-analysis and self-renewals tool in future processes. Now why is OD process important? Now very important question that anybody would ask is that my company is doing fine, we are perfectly okay, my employees motivation graph is increasing, my employees are happy, why should we go ahead with OD process at all? It is not. As I clearly said in my beginning of my presentation, that there doesn't have to be a problem for an OD intervention to happen. It doesn't have to be a question of survival for an OD intervention to happen. It doesn't require that the company, tomorrow you go and you find that your company closes and suddenly we talk about OD intervention. Yet OD process is a very important process. So I would now like to cover why OD processes is important. Organization change. Now the process of organization development identifies areas of company operations where change is needed. Each need is analyzed and the potential effects are projected into change management plan. Without organization development as a part of change management, a company would have a very difficult time in developing effective change management programs. So as rightly said, that if we have been doing same thing for same years, we will always be getting a similar result. For an organization to move from good to great, organization development interventions are required. Growth, very important. Why do we need OD process? It is because it leads to growth. An organization development analysis brings together sales projection and consumer demands to help determine the rate of the company growth. This information is used to alter company's business plan and plan the expansion and use of company resources such as personnel and distribution network to accommodate future growth. So it is very important that the organization, in case they are planning for expansions, they will come to know, okay, these are my competency areas, and if I expand, this is what I'm going to achieve. So OD process becomes very, very important. Work processes. When a company is involved in the organization development, it analyzes work processes for efficiency and accuracy. OD intervention actually helps the organization to find out that if my systems are working with efficiency and accuracy, and if any quality control measure requires to attain to put the company standards in place. Innovation. Very important. Product innovation requires the analysis of several kinds of information to be successful. Organization development is critical to product innovation because it can help analyze each element of product development and create a method for using it effectively. Some of the processes that come together in organization development to assist in product innovation are competitive analysis, technology development, consumer preferences, target market research, manufacturing capability analysis, patents and trademarks. Application of the concept of OD processes. Now, OD process actually talks about improvement of efficiency and productivity. It's a win-win situation for employers and employees, and it's a promotion of a continuous improvement culture. OD processes actually talks about quality improvement, the continuous way of bringing change in the systems. And as again I would repeat that if we have been doing the same thing again and again, we would be in the same process, we would be getting the same results again and again in going ahead. So if an organization has to improve, on its efficiency and productivity, it has to manage things in a different way. Conclusion. The basic building blocks of organization are groups. So the base unit of change are groups and non-individuals. An OD process always talks about group, it talks about team, it talks about the organization as a whole. It never talks about individuals. And always relevant change goal is the reduction of an inappropriate competition between the parts of the organization. So actually OD brings in more collaborative conditions. It talks about more teamwork within the group. It talks about it reduces inappropriate competition. It talks about one team, one goal. One goal of a healthy organization is to develop open communication, mutual trust and confidence between and across organization levels. People support what they help create. So people actually start taking sense of ownership in planning and conduction of change. When people become a part of a change, they take the ownership of that change and become the change agent themselves. That brings me to the end of this particular presentation. My next topic in OD would be roles of managers in organization development. Thank you for patiently listening to me. In case you have liked our video, do subscribe to our channel Edupedia World. For more videos, log on to www.edupediaworld.com.